Ever tackled a big API revamp? You know, the kind where you almost feel like you're rebuilding from scratch. It can be a real headache, right?
Yeah.
But what if there was a smoother way?
A way to just swap out the blueprint instead of rewiring the entire system.
Exactly. And that's where the facade pattern swoops in, like a stylish building front that hides all the complex stuff happening behind the scenes. And in this deep dive, we're taking a look at a blog post about a really neat way to implement facades using FastAPI.
FastAPI, a modern Python web framework.
That's the one. Now, the author of this post was really focused on streamlining how the front end of an application interacts with, well, all its various services. It's like trying to get a whole bunch of different instruments to play together in harmony, right?
And their company was using a facade layer, which is a fantastic approach for organization, but they found that adding new features involved quite a bit of manual work.
Right. So they were already on the right track with the facade, but they wanted to make it even slicker. And their solution, well, they basically said, why not use a JSON file to define how our facade should behave?
It's a really elegant solution.
Oh, absolutely. It's like having a configuration-driven facade.
Exactly, using this JSON file as its blueprint.
So walk us through this JSON file. How does it actually work? What does it look like?
Okay, so picture this. Each key in this JSON object represents an endpoint in your API.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
All right, so for each endpoint, you define where requests to that endpoint should be routed, any data preprocessing steps that need to happen,
I see where you're going with this.
and even any post-processing for the responses, like formatting the data in a way that's suitable for the client.
Okay, so the JSON file is like a detailed set of instructions for the facade telling it exactly what to do with each incoming request. Now, I'm curious about how the author handles things like data validation or transforming that response before sending it back.
Right, right.
They mentioned using Python decorators, which I always find fascinating, but a tad mysterious, to be honest.
Decorators are really powerful, you're right.
They are.
A great way to add functionality to existing code without directly modifying the code itself.
Right, right.
In this case, the author is using decorators to mark specific functions that are responsible for those pre-processing or post-processing tasks.
Okay, that makes sense.
So, for example, imagine you need to validate incoming data for a particular endpoint. You could write a separate function specifically to perform those validation checks,
Okay.
and then simply decorate your main endpoint handler with this validation function.
So it's like saying, hey, before you run the main function for this endpoint, run this validation function first.
Exactly. You got it.
Mm-hmm. I'm starting to see how this all fits together. So we've got the JSON file acting as our blueprint, defining the endpoints and how they should be handled, and then decorators come in to handle those pre- and post-processing steps in a really elegant way.
It's a beautiful example of separation of concerns, which is essential for keeping your code base maintainable and understandable.
Absolutely. And the author even gave a cool example of using this post-processing to simplify product data, right? Say an internal service returns a ton of information about a product, but the front end only needs like the ID, the title, and the price. You can write a post-processing function to grab just those pieces of information, package them up neatly, and send that back to the client.
Exactly, and that's a key benefit of using this kind of configuration-driven approach. You have so much flexibility in shaping how data flows through your facade.
It's like having a custom-tailored data pipeline. It's like taking this big, complicated response and boiling it down to just the essentials, huh?
Exactly. And the best part, if you ever need to change what data gets sent back or how it's formatted, you can simply update the configuration or tweak the post-processing logic.
And you don't even have to touch that core facade code, which is amazing for maintainability. Now, something else that caught my eye. The author mentioned their FastAPI application dynamically generates routes based on this JSON configuration. Can you shed some light on that? It sounds almost like magic.
It's a really cool feature of FastAPI. Instead of having to hard code each endpoint in your application, you can leverage FastAPI's routing mechanisms to create them on the fly, based on your configuration.
So when the application boots up, it reads that JSON file, sees what endpoints are defined, and automatically creates the corresponding routes.
Yep, that's the gist of it.
That's amazing. It means you're not manually updating your routing logic every time you adjust an endpoint in your facade.
Exactly. Keeps things very flexible and reduces those manual errors that can creep in.
This whole approach is incredibly impressive, I gotta say. Seems like a really robust way to build these adaptable APIs. But of course, every rose has its thorns, right? With great power comes great responsibility, as they say. Are there any potential downsides to keep in mind?
That's a great question. Like any design pattern, there are trade-offs.
Right, there's no such thing as a free lunch.
Exactly. One thing to consider is that while a configuration file is fantastic for simpler cases, it can become, well, a bit unwieldy if your facade has a ton of endpoints or really intricate routing rules.
Right, so it's about finding that sweet spot, because if the configuration itself becomes a burden, then it kind of defeats the purpose of simplifying things.
Exactly. Another point to keep in mind is error handling. If something goes awry within one of your pre-processing or post-processing functions, tracking down that issue might require a bit more detective work.
Because the logic is determined dynamically based on the configuration, as opposed to being explicitly spelled out in the code.
Right, you've got an extra layer of indirection, which can make debugging a bit trickier.
It's that classic trade-off, isn't it? You gain flexibility and maintainability with this configuration-driven setup, but you might lose a little bit of transparency when it comes to debugging.
Absolutely, it's a balancing act, for sure.
Always a balancing act in software development, isn't it?
Always.
Now, regarding the JSON configuration itself, could you give us a glimpse of what that might look like in practice?
Sure, let's imagine we have that endpoint for fetching product information, the one we talked about earlier. The JSON configuration for that endpoint might look something like this. You'd have an endpoints key, and under that, an entry for, let's say, products. And this entry would specify things like the service to use, the specific method to call on that service, and the names of any pre-processing or post-processing functions that should be applied.
It's like a little recipe for each endpoint, guiding the facade on exactly what needs to be done.
Precisely. And because it's in this structured format like JSON, it's easily understood by both humans and machines.
Which is always a good thing. Now, this ties back to something we touched upon earlier, Python decorators. I think it'd be really helpful to give a concrete example of how those decorators are used in this context.
Absolutely. So let's say we've got that simplify product data function we mentioned earlier.
The one that trims down the product data, right?
That's the one. It takes the full product data, all those details from the internal service, and just returns a streamlined version with the ID, the title, and the price of the important stuff. Now, to use this function as a post-processing step, you'd utilize a decorator provided by the author's framework.
So it might look something like post-process simplify product data placed just above the function definition for our product's endpoint.
You got it. That's exactly how it will work.
Okay, now it's all clicking into place.
That decorator basically ensures that after the facade retrieves all that product data, it gets passed through our simplify function before it's sent back to the client waiting patiently on the other end.
It's like we're attaching a little helper function to our endpoint, and all it takes is a single line of code.
That's the beauty of it. And this is just one example. We can use decorators for validation, data transformation, logging, you name it.
So many possibilities. So just to recap, we've got our JSON blueprint laying the groundwork, decorators adding in all those extra functionalities, and FastAPI dynamically spinning up routes as needed. It's a pretty ingenious system.
It really shows how effective a well-chosen design pattern can be, especially when it's paired with a flexible framework like FastAPI, like we've been talking about.
It makes you realize that sometimes the most elegant solutions are often the ones that prioritize, simplicity and flexibility.
Absolutely. Sometimes it's about challenging those traditional ways of doing things, thinking outside the box a bit.
Exactly. And this deep dive is a perfect example of that. It's given us a lot to think about, hasn't it?
It really has.
We've explored how using a configuration file can make your APIs incredibly adaptable.
Right. But it's crucial to weigh those advantages against the potential challenges, like we discussed, things like debugging and managing complexity as your project grows.
Absolutely. It always comes back to finding the right balance for the task at hand.
Always a balancing act.
Well said. This has been a fascinating deep dive into facades, configuration-driven development, and really just the power of creativity in software design. It's inspiring to see how developers are constantly pushing the boundaries and coming up with these elegant solutions to complex problems.
Definitely. Keep things interesting.
It certainly does. Until next time, everyone, keep exploring, keep experimenting, and keep those coding skills sharp.